The committee will reconvene and come to order. So the chair recognizes Mr. Kine. For what purposes does the gentleman seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I do have an amendment, final amendment on this bill at the desk.
The gentleman from Wisconsin recognized for purposes of offering his amendment, Mr. Nunes.
Point of order.
Point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentleman to suspend while the clerk distributes.
You are.
Yeah. So here's.
I'm right in the middle of my amendment right now.
Thanks.
Where's the phone?
I just put it down. It's right there.
Oh, you didn't see it?
Well, I got the phone, but I didn't know where the back is. Where did you have it, or did you find it?
You want that, right?
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment is so reasonable. I'm sure we can defer of any discussion about it and just go straight to adoption by voice vote and move to final passage of the bill. But if you insist, I will discuss it briefly. Mr. Chairman, my amendment is very simple. All it calls for is that veterans with pre-existing conditions are not discriminated against or face higher premiums because of those pre-existing conditions, as current law currently protects them. This is consistent with the amendment that Mr. Dalbeni offered earlier today, where it protected any American with pre-existing conditions from any form of discrimination or higher premium increases. But it also, I think, speaks to Ms. Chu's amendment in protecting mental health services, especially for veterans out there. And I know earlier in the day, Mr. Chairman, there was a brief discussion in committee about what rational state would actually apply for a waiver that would allow insurance plans to discriminate against people, including veterans, with pre-existing conditions. Now, that may be true if the state is run with a Democratic governor or Democratic legislature, but that may not necessarily be true if it's a Republican governor or a Republican legislature in charge. And you don't have to take my word for it, because earlier in May, shortly after passage of the after the Republican health care bill was pulled, there were press reports in Wisconsin confirming that our governor, Walker, was seriously considering applying for the waiver. In fact, there was a press report from the Associated Press dated May 15, 2017, titled, "Wisconsin Governor May Seek Waiver to Let Insurers Hike Premiums for Pre-Existing Conditions." President Walker has not announced that. He has not walked back his comment about it. And this is a very real threat now that over 852,000 non-elderly Wisconsin residents are facing if Governor Walker and his legislature decide to move forward on that waiver, which, as you know, the Republican health care bill would allow. That's roughly a quarter of the non-elderly population in Wisconsin, Mr. Chairman. This amendment, though, is narrowed specifically to just prohibiting that type of discrimination against veterans with pre-existing conditions. And as Ms. Chu pointed out earlier, over 58% of them who have come home have some form of mental illness that requires treatment, and well over half of them have some physical ailment that requires attention and treatment. Pre-existing conditions that insurance plans may ultimately discriminate against. I just cannot believe that this committee, in good conscience, would, to our men and women in uniform returning from service abroad who have physical or mental needs that have to be taken care of in this country, would allow private insurance plans to discriminate against them through denial or higher premiums because of pre-existing conditions that our veterans have. This amendment would protect our veterans. This amendment would allow our committee to do the right thing. It would improve the legislation that's before us. And with that, I encourage its adoption. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kine. Mr. Nunes.
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order of the amendment because it is not germane to the amendment in nature of a substitute. The amendment is outside the committee's jurisdiction.
Thank you. Does the gentleman offering the amendment wish to speak on the point of order?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I believe this is in order. It is directly germane to the legislation before it, since it's limited to veterans only. It is the jurisdiction of this committee, and therefore, I believe that it meets the requirements for germaneness, and it is in order. And again, I would encourage its adoption.
Thank you, Mr. Kine. I am prepared to rule the amendment is not germane to the amendment in nature substitute because it amends the Public Health Service Act, which is an energy and commerce jurisdiction. The point of order is sustained amendments is not in order.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask unanimous consent, though, to have the article I just cited dated May 5th, 2017 included in the record?
Without objection.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there further amendments? If there are no further amendments, questions on the adoption amendment, the nature of a substitute, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In chair, the ayes have it. The amendment, the nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Nunes for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 2372 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Questions on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 2372 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 2372 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Would like to do on suspension, so can we do a recorded vote? I think we're going to have to go forward. Roll call? Sorry. So look, the roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Nunes? Mr. Nunes? Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Marchant? Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Bishop? Oh, Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Paulson? Mr. Marchant? Ms. Black? Mr. Holding? Aye. Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer?
No.
Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley, no. Ms. Delbene? Chairman Brady?
Looks kind of impressive.
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
You may want to be an original co-sponsor on this. I didn't yet. I just checked with my staff, and I don't have you and Mr. Kind. But here's what it does. We're launching it tomorrow, but our deadline.
Mr. Marchant, how are you? Do you wish to be recorded?
Mr. Marchant is not recorded.
Say this.
How do you wish to be recorded?
General McChrystal is going to be there with us to say we've
Mr. Marchant, yes.
volunteers by 2026, which is by September. But for people that are in the Peace Corps currently, we're going to provide a tax break because they're paying, they make such large shit. And we elevate the Corporation for National Community Service to a cabinet level position. And then we say they establish for people who are willing to serve their country. If you get out of college, you're in debt, you want to serve your nation, I'll forgive your debt. If you want to get to college or in other training, you serve your nation, I'll help you get to college. For every year of service established by the Corporation for National Community Service, we give you the equivalent nationwide of 2 years of in-state
Clerk will call the roll, or excuse me, report the vote.
for forgiveness.
22 yeas, 14 nays.
This vote, the ayes are 22 and the noes are 14. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 2372 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical conforming change to the bill, and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views. Our next order of business, H.R. 2579, the Broader Options for Americans Act. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 2579. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in the nature substitute which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Bartold, Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Neal. The members of the committee have before them 2 documents, JCX 23 and JCX 24, which describe H.R. 2579 and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute makes some clerical changes and adds a short title by way of review of the underlying legislation. Under present law, employer-sponsored plans generally are required to offer an employee, spouse, dependent child covered by the plan an opportunity to continue coverage after separation from employment. This is referred to as COBRA continuation coverage. The American Health Care Act would qualify health plans for qualified health insurance if they're offered in individual health exchanges. Contingent upon the enactment of the American Health Care Act, the proposal would amend the definition of a qualified health plan under the AHCA relating to new premium assistance to include unsubsidized COBRA continuation coverage. So that is, if a separated employee gets COBRA coverage and is paying out of pocket, that employee would be eligible for the premium assistance credit offered under the AHCA. The provision, contingent upon enactment of the AHCA, would be effective for taxable years after December 31st, 2019. That concludes my brief description of the legislation. Be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Excuse me, thank you. Are there any questions in the amendment of the nature of substitute? Yes, sir. Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Neal.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Is Mr. Neal's recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the Congressional Budget Office has scored the recent House-passed Republican health care plan, and it's very obvious that it remains a bad deal for consumers. It penalizes older Americans with pre-existing conditions, and it takes away coverage from 23 million working families. The bill remains a giveaway to the wealthy, those at the higher income levels of American life. This CBO score confirms just about everything that we've suspected and leads us to believe that that's the reason that there was not an effort earlier to secure a CBO score before we voted on a bill which we had no idea what it would cost or who would be harmed by it. But CBO does indicate $834 billion worth of cuts to Medicaid. It also estimates that revenues would decline over the years, and not to miss the fact that it confirms what Mr. Levin and others have been saying about the harm that would be done to Americans with pre-existing conditions. It would increase premiums, would strip benefits, strip coverage, and it would include issues that we've made a priority on our side over these last few years, including help with those women who find themselves in need of health care. And also, I think that it's important that some enrollees would see large increases in out-of-pocket expenditure because annual or lifetime limits would be further disallowed. This could happen, for example, to some people who use expensive prescription drugs. So this is just something that we've acquired since we went over to the floor. The CBO issued their report, and I must tell you, Mr. Chairman, it confirms precisely what we have been saying now for the last few months about the Republican plan to replace the Affordable Care Act. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Deal. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Mr. Crowley, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. In reference to the recent CBO score, I think it's important to point out the first markup that took place of the health care bill that our Republican colleagues so desperately worked to get out of the House. That bill was on a bill that we had less than 40 hours to see, in which we didn't have a CBO score. And that's also what happened the second go-around as well, no CBO score, in which we later learned would take away, initially from the first bill, 24 million people would lose their health care. Big news, folks, big news. 23 million people under the second CBO score, they're still going to lose their health care under the bill that you all passed. A bill that was terrible the first time you tried to pass it. I think my colleagues on the other side of the aisle know that that's why they didn't pass it the first time. We had hours of debate on the floor, and then the bill got pulled at the last minute. It was an ugly process, full of backroom deals and political promises, not to mention all the inconsistencies and oversights that were contained in the hastily conceived text of the bill. See, here we are today considering these three bills that do not in any way address America's priorities. They don't put forward a jobs agenda or strengthen our economy. They don't grow and protect the middle class or support working men and women. They're just to clean up the mess that you all did initially in the bill that you got out of the House. That repeal bill, I might add, isn't even going to pass the Senate. So whatever indication you thought your colleagues over there were going to take your bill and pass it, I think that's been pretty much wiped away. The bill we're considering here today are actually written to amend the horrible bill that was passed just a couple weeks ago. Again, one that will never become law. So this markup is even more of a waste of time, quite frankly. I think it's important to note that still 14 million people will lose their health care insurance in the first 2 years of the bill that you passed a couple weeks ago. No different from the first bill that you didn't pass because you couldn't get the votes together to do it. The second go-around, there's no difference. I want everyone to understand that when you couldn't pass the bill the first time, when you pass it the second time, there's virtually no difference between the two bills. Virtually no difference. The CBO score is out now. The truth is known, the American people understand it, that cuts to Medicaid by over $834 billion. That's still true. It's $5 billion less in Medicaid cuts than the CBO's last estimate. So we appreciate that it's no longer $839 billion in cuts to Medicaid. It's only $834 billion in cuts to Medicaid. So we appreciate that very much. It's in huge savings. Yes, the CBO estimates that revenues would decline by $992 billion relative to current law. That compares to $999 billion in the last estimate. So we appreciate the marginal changes here. They're very, very important, I guess, to the bottom line. The biggest bottom line is 23 million Americans still will lose their insurance because of the bill that you all passed. For those of you who have the strength to vote against the bill, we appreciate that. For the rest of you, you have a lot of explaining to do when you go back to your constituents once the CBO score came out. I wish you well, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. You're recognized. Strike the last word.
Because the issue came up earlier today, I want to read from CBO. It relates to pre-existing conditions. And I'm reading from their report. Community-rated premiums would rise over time, and people who are less healthy, including those with pre-existing or newly acquired medical conditions, would ultimately be unable to purchase comprehensive non-group health insurance at premiums comparable to those under current law if they could purchase it at all. If they could purchase it at all. I think that's a nail in the coffin, there are already many, of the bill that you pushed through the House. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Recognizing myself today, the CBO confirmed the American Health Care Act will further lower premiums, deliver more immediate tax relief for individuals and families, and decrease the deficit. This report makes clear ACHA is an important step toward rescuing Americans from Obamacare's failures, including fewer and fewer health care options and higher premiums. Under our proposal, individuals and families in Texas and across the country will have the freedom to choose a health care plan that's right for them, and Washington will no longer force Americans to buy expensive, inadequate coverage they don't like and cannot afford to use. As the Senate continues its work to strengthen this legislation, House Republicans will move forward with even more solutions to fix our nation's broken health care system and increase access to affordable, quality health care for all Americans. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, questions on the adoption amendment in the nature of substitute, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Nunes for the purpose of offering an motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 2579 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Questions on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 2579 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 2579 is amended. It's ordered favorably reported to the House. A roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson, Mr. Nunez. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Tiberi. Mr. Tiberi, aye. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska. Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci. Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan. Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome. Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding. Aye. Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri. Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski. Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo. Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley. Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Delbene. Ms. Delbene, no. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Johnson. Ms. Black. Mr. Smith of Missouri. Mr. Smith, yes. Chairman Brady. Chairman Brady, aye.
Excuse me, the clerk will report the vote.
23 yeas, 15 nays.
On this vote, the ayes are 23 and the nays are 15. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 2579, as amended, is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to bill, and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our final order of business, H.R. 2581, the Verify First Act. The committee will now proceed to consideration of the bill. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time I offer an amendment in the nature of substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Barthold, the Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Neal. Members of the committee have before them 2 joint committee documents, JCX 25 and JCX 26, which describe H.R. 2581 and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. The chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute makes some clerical changes, particularly to the effective date. So just a brief review of the underlying legislation. Under present law, as part of the process of enrollment in a qualified health plan through an exchange, an individual must provide information on income, family size, changes in marital or family status or income, and information relating to their U.S. citizenship, nationality, or lawfully present status. The proposal before you, in the Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute, would provide that no advance payments would be made relative to the present law premium tax credits, and that no advance payments would be made under the AHCA's premium tax credits unless the Secretary of the Treasury has received confirmation from the Secretary of HHS that the Commissioner of Social Security or the Secretary of Homeland Security has verified the individual's status as a citizen or national of the United States or an alien lawfully present in the United States, using a process that includes appropriate use of information related to citizenship or immigration status. This provision relative to the present law credits under the Affordable Care Act would be effective for taxable years after December 31st, 2017, with respect to credits that may be claimed after enactment of the AHCA with respect to taxable years after December 31st, 2019. That concludes my brief description. Be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Are there questions about the amendment and the nature of a substitute? Mr. Levin?
Mr. Kind, is there a score for this?
Mr. Levin, relative to present law, this would have no effect because it's contingent upon enactment of legislation that has not been enacted yet. So the trigger hasn't been triggered. So under this under estimating conventions for House and Senate scorecards, there is no revenue effect.
Do you have any idea what it would be?
Well, I don't have any idea whether the underlying legislation would be enacted, so it's probably not appropriate for me to make a guess. Mr. Levin, I should note the Congress has enacted in the past a number of triggering events for provisions. In some respects, it's not that unusual.
Thank you. Mr. Renace, you're recognized to question Mr. Barthold. Thank you. Mr. Kine, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, can you tell me, your analysis of the legislation before us, whether any law-abiding American citizen would be delayed with their health care coverage or perhaps denied health care coverage because of the additional verification requirement under this bill?
Let me give you a slightly long answer. The provision itself relates to payment, advance payment of premium tax credits. So right. It doesn't relate to whether one is eligible ultimately for the credit or not. So I interpret your question then to be, is it possible that someone who is a lawful U.S. citizen, you know, as you described, could their approval for an advance credit be slowed? That is possible. An example.
And isn't it possible, Mr. Barthold, that if
I said it is possible.
And if that's possible, isn't it possible that that individual is very dependent on that advance credit in order to afford the health care coverage that they're applying for, and therefore they wouldn't be able to get it? Is that possible too?
That I would have to admit that would be possible on a cash flow basis.
There's a possibility here that you have some law-abiding American citizens that could be either denied health care coverage or delayed in getting health care coverage at a crucial moment of their life because of this legislation before us. Is that a fairly accurate statement?
They would not be per se denied the coverage. Your conclusion that they might not, given their cash flow, be able to afford it, I have to agree with.
Yeah. And you know, Mr. Chairman, that's part of the problem of what we're going through, this facade here today. We are flying blind. We are trying to put wheels on a car that's already hurtling down the highway. We haven't had one hearing on any one of these bills before us. Not one analysis by the Congressional Budget Office or by any expert or any expert witness coming before this committee. And that's a horrible way to make health care policy. I mean, let's get real. We're talking about 1/5 of the entire U.S. economy the healthcare system. We're talking about almost 1/2 of all federal discretionary spending, healthcare costs. We're talking about people's lives and what we're doing here today. And we don't have the common decency to stand up for the integrity of this committee and have one hearing on what we're doing here today. And we're asking Mr. Barthel to conject and to speculate and to guess on what the real impact of this is going to be on American lives. We should just be ashamed of ourselves for a moment here, of how we're going about all of this. This is all cover your butt time today, because of things that you might have overlooked when you were jamming through that health care bill just a few weeks ago and starting to get some pushback and some feedback going. Well, you didn't think about this. Well, you didn't think about this implication. And now suddenly we're here today wasting hours trying to catch up with that speeding vehicle down the highway and trying to make a bad bill somewhat better. But in the meantime, we're still playing with people's lives. And now the Congressional Budget Office just came out and showed 23 million more uninsured under your legislation. That a typical older American in my congressional district in rural Wisconsin, 64-year-old, under current law paying $1,700 for their premiums, under your bill that you just jammed through, would go up to $13,600 or $16,100 according to the CBO. That's an increase of $12,000 to $14,000 a year. We got a saying for that back home. That dog ain't going to hunt in my district, and it's not going to hunt in any rural district throughout America. And this is something that we should have been discussing during hearings before we even went to a markup on this legislation. And now we're getting a CBO score weeks after the bill passed, flying blind and trying to establish health care policy. I mean, where are we going with all this? I mean, how do we explain this to the American people who are calling our offices now scared to death because their child has a pre-existing condition and they're not sure, looking into the future under your policy, whether their child's going to be able to keep coverage? That's just a horrible place to put these families in right now. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Mr. Barthel, because, again, no analysis, no hearing. We're just flying blind here. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized. A question, Mr. Barthel.
Yeah, I do have a question for Mr. Barthel. And I'd like to submit this for the record. There's an article that came out on February 8th of 2016. This is from the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. Examined the Affordable Care Act tax credits meant to defray the cost of insurance premiums. It found that as of June 2015, the administration awarded approximately $750 million in tax credits on the behalf of individuals who were later determined to be ineligible because they failed to verify their citizenship, their status as a national, or their legal presence. Mr. Barthel, this amendment is about verifying and preventing fraud. This has absolutely nothing to do with anything else in the protecting hardworking American taxpayer dollars. Is there anything in this amendment that doesn't line up with exactly what the Affordable Care Act had talked about in the beginning? I understand giving people these subsidies, but there's also a little bit about that. You actually should have to qualify for them. Just saying, I think I qualify, doesn't entitle you to $750 million in American taxpayer money. And as much as I hear the bleeding hearts, I also like to tell you that people's wallets are strained to the point right now, they look here to try and find out, why do we have arguments, why do we have debate over simply trying to prevent fraud? It can't get any more basic than that. So if you want to give subsidies, I understand that. But for God's sake, they ought to at least qualify, and we should at least be able to verify them. It's pretty hard to go after money that's already been given out months after it's been given out. I said, oh, by the way, you never qualified for this, so we'd like you to send the money back. Good luck with that one. So is there anything at all in this amendment that says that these people aren't going to get subsidies? All it says is you have to be verified. How simple is that? I yield back. I don't know, Mr. Barthel. I know you've got to sit here all day and listen to this, but I'm so sick and tired of political issues taking place over good policy. We're talking about people's monies. Oh, yeah. I know. I heard it, guys. I've only been here 7 years, but you know what? If you want to talk about how great Obamacare, please talk to people who actually don't have They have an insurance card, but they have no coverage. So we can go on with this. We can kick this horse. It ain't going to move. But I would just say this. The issue is about this amendment right now. It isn't about all the other things. If you want to talk about them, talk about them. But talk about this first, H.R. 2581, the Verify First Act, and tell me that somehow you're against fraud.
Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
If you want to go ahead to Ms. Chu, I have one more.
Ms. Chu, you're recognized.
Mr. Bartold, is this $750 million that is being alleged to be fraudulent actually correct or not?
I'm not familiar with the letter that Mr. Kelly referred to.
Okay, well, I am. And it comes from a misinformed reading of a GAO report and a sloppy Senate committee report. The $750 million figure touted by the bill's author comes from a Senate committee report which takes faulty assumptions and then uses little more than guesswork to arrive at a number that has no actual support. In fact, it's based on a made-up estimate on cost and an absurd assumption that all people whose plans were canceled were undocumented. There were people whose plans were canceled, but guess what? They were due to such things as they couldn't find their Social Security numbers. Many of them were U.S. citizens. They'd been recently married. They changed their names. They had an error somewhere in the Social Security records. They were Americans that were born abroad. They were newborns whose names had not yet been put into the record, therefore they didn't get a Social Security number. It also includes victims of domestic violence and human trafficking whose data is often stored manually, hence they do not have a Social Security record on number that is in the records. And so the committee report assumed that all people whose insurance plans that were canceled were ineligible immigrants. That was not correct.
I missed the question, Ms. Chu. I'm sorry.
My question was I answered my own question.
No, I mean, I'm not familiar with the
Yes.
study, so
Okay,
I
I
can't
understand.
comment on the study. I'm
Thank
sorry.
Gentlelady, yield back.
Yes, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Onassi, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to move to strike the last word.
Tell you what, we are on questions. Mr. Bartold, let me go to Mr. Doggett.
Thank you very much. I certainly share Mr. Kine's view about the dangers of voting first and asking questions later, and that's what's happening again today, just like it happened with the original passage of this. But I have some specific questions, Mr. Barthold. What type of individuals, or let me ask it this way, what are the other methods that one can take to verify their status as a citizen who's other than using a Social Security number?
Passport would be fine.
Right.
Presumably for
birth certificate.
Birth certificates.
What types of people typically file their tax returns using only an I-10?
Other information, certificates of naturalization, for example.
Right.
Green card status for permanent residence. But you had a.
What type of people? What types of people typically file their tax returns using only an I-10?
I-10s are reserved for foreign persons who generally don't have work status in the United States, but have a U.S. federal income tax liability.
Do you know how many U.S. citizen children are currently receiving advanced premium tax credits?
Children, no. I can roughly for the 2014 tax year, there were some 3.1 million returns in a preliminary count of the data from that year that had claimed premium tax credits. Cannot distinguish from that data how many of those returns claimed the advanced payment.
I represent a significant portion of San Antonio, Texas, and there is data there that the number of families that have an undocumented member of the family of Mexican origin that it's something like only 7% have come in the last 10 years. So we have people there who are not only parents of American citizen children, they are grandparents of American citizen children. What challenges would you expect for an American citizen child entitled to tax credit coverage or American grandchild entitled to tax credit coverage in the care of someone who is undocumented?
In terms of documenting eligibility for advance payment, which is what this legislation is about, if the child has a valid Social Security number, that should be sufficient evidence.
Most children don't have a Social Security number, do they? That's the whole. That's what we're talking about here. The whole problem of
in most states, and I don't know Texas specifically. The system is set up. You're born in the hospital, and they immediately start a record process of filing for a Social Security number. That's not ubiquitous, I don't think, but
no, it's not. And it seems to me that this bill poses many problems for American citizen children who may have in their lineage one parent who's not properly documented, or a grandparent that's caring for them that's not properly documented. And the effect of this may be that they eventually get coverage, but they have a health care problem and they can't wait a month or 2 months or 3 months to get that coverage. And that will be the effect of this bill, will be a delay. And the period of delay at the time they need health coverage, you're unable to say how long that might take.
No, I cannot not tell you time period, sir.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. Does anyone else wish to question Mr. Bartow? Does anyone wish to strike the last word, Mr. Renacci?
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to support H.R. 2581, the Verify First Act, introduced by my good friend, Congressman Lou Barletta. This legislation seeks to remedy one of the many oversights of the Affordable Care Act, not the AHCA, the Affordable Care Act, and was failed to address an oversight that is cost, by one report that we heard, $750 million to American taxpayers. But I don't care if it's $750 million or $750 or $75. If it's money that's going out improperly, people, these hard-earned taxpayers, do not want to see money going out improperly. I don't think the American people care about that. They care about dollars being spent and this issue being corrected. Under the current system, the Treasury disperses credits to individuals before their applications have been verified. If the IRS then finds out that an individual is not eligible, it is impossible to recover this money. This legislation just simply closes a loophole by requiring the individual to be verified as lawfully present before the Treasury releases the money. It is pretty simple. Our constituents depend on us to responsibly spend their hard-earned tax dollars. This legislation is a commitment to that responsibility. It is important to also understand that this issue at hand is about the poor stewardship of hard-earned taxpayers' dollars. The sole intent of these credits was for them to be used lawfully, and this legislation helps ensure just that. At a time when our national debt is $19 trillion and counting, it makes no sense for the federal government to continue to write these blank checks and borrow money from China to do it. With that, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2581, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Mr. Pascal?
Yes, I'd like to yield first to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Kind.
I thank my friend for yielding. You know, I've been around here long enough to understand that when a member sits there and says, this is very clear, this is very simple, chances are it's not all that clear, it's not all that simple. And it goes back to my original point, Mr. Chairman. It's exactly why we have hearings in this committee and call experts in to testify about the consequences and the unintended consequences of what we're trying to fix or do here. And absent that, again, we're flying blind. I mean, we're playing with people's lives here. Law-abiding American citizens who could be denied or delayed coverage of health care at a crucial moment in their life, whether they're battling cancer or they might have a child that's sick and in need of immediate care. The last thing they should have to be worrying about is personal bankruptcy, because they got to liquidate their entire assets because they don't qualify for tax credits to afford a health care plan to make sure that their child's being taken care of. And that's why, again, we've got to get back to regular order around here and start making good policy instead of just presuming that it's clear and presuming that it's simple. And I yield back to my friend.
Thank you, Mr. I just want to conclude with this, Mr. Chairman. No one that I know of on our committee has ever supported or in any manner, shape, or form sponsored fraudulent efforts to gain federal revenue. I don't think anybody would support that. But when we take 3 or 4 cases or 100 cases and we try to make this the example of a piece of legislation that has been passed democratically, unlike the one that was just passed several weeks ago, then that causes us to pause. It really does. You're making a big deal. This is making a mountain out of a molehill. We need the specifics. We have different reports, different numbers, but we're all together in the process of trying to stamp out fraud in any program. You know, it's like saying, we got to stop this fraudulent voting. And then you bring in an example of 3 people and you say, see what we need to do. Now, what they're doing, if they're fraudulently voting, is wrong. But if you're making a big deal out of it and you're not in any way moving the ball down the field, what the heck good is it? Mr. Chairman, I hope you listened very carefully to what the gentleman from Wisconsin said. He said it in good faith. I give back my time.
Excuse me, Mr. Keller, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'm glad we're all in agreement that preventing fraud is a good thing for hardworking American taxpayers. I just want to make sure that we understand something. That we're talking about 2 different pieces of health care tonight. We're talking about the Affordable Care Act, which is law and is currently law. We're talking about the American Health Care Act, which came through this committee and went through the House, but is now, but we got the score today and it has to go over to the Senate. So it's not law. It's not law. It's a proposed law that's going to the Senate. This amendment doesn't change one thing. All it says is verification. Let's just make sure we do verification. This is part of the Affordable Care Act. It is not part of the American Health Care. It's about the Affordable Care Act and making sure that we're verifying that whoever these subsidies are given to, and keep in mind, these subsidies are actually out of the pockets of hardworking American taxpayers. This confusion that somehow it comes from the United States government is entirely false. You got to know where the revenue starts to understand who it is that's responsible. We are the stewards of this. This bill, it also ensures that someone isn't penalized for not having continuous health care coverage if there is a delay in verifying their documents. For example, if a guy named Bill submits a form that in his real name is William, his legal name is William, this will trigger a mismatch with his Social Security number, which would have to be verified. He's not going to see his health care rates jacked up to 30% for filling out the form incorrectly. And my friend from Wisconsin says, and I think everybody today started off with every amendment they talked about is, this is just a common sense approach to fixing something that's wrong. This is just a common sense approach to protecting hard-working American taxpayer money. There's nothing that's more basic than that. That's so fundamental, and we all come here for the same thing. I hear it on both sides. That's not a partisan issue. I don't know whose dollars are coming in here. I don't know if there's Republican dollars and there's Democrat dollars and there's independent. I mean, all these folks are just American taxpayers. Our job is a stewardship. It isn't my money. It isn't your money. It's taxpayer money. So if we ever forget that at some point, we're the ones that ultimately are responsible for protecting and being the good stewards of this, then we're missing the boat. This is not a political battle. It's not. It's just common sense protecting the dollars that the taxpayers send to us. That's so basic. So basic. So I just go back. Mr. Barletta's amendment just makes sense to me, but I come from an altogether, I don't come from a different world. I actually come from a different galaxy. I'm convinced of that now. And I've been in the automobile business for a long time. I tell you this, guys.
Mr. Chairman, will the gentleman yield? I agree with him.
In a minute. Well, Mr. Crowley, with our Irish backgrounds, I know how we can go back and forth all night like this. And with Billy sitting beside you, I know this could get fun. But I just want you to think, I'm an automobile dealer. Can you imagine? Somebody comes in to buy us a car, and I say, go ahead and take it, and don't worry about us making sure your check is going to clear. Take it. And if it doesn't clear, we'll come back and see you later. It just doesn't make sense. In the real world, and I keep saying this, I know people say, you don't have to go. Listen, it is so hard for somebody who comes here from the private sector to ever be able to line up and understand somehow where these conversations are going. It just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't matter how you're registered. It just is common sense. Common sense is common sense. It isn't specific to any one party affiliation. So, listen, I think Mr. Barletta came up with a great idea, prevents fraud. I don't think that's a bad thing. It actually brings some kind of sensibility to what we're trying to do, and really, this is part of the Affordable Care Act. This is how it all started. So, listen, I'm all on board with making sure people get subsidies that they're entitled to. I just want to make sure that we verify them first. I don't think that's too far out there. I think it's pretty much common sense, at least, again, from the galaxy that I came from. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez, you recognize strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill only makes sense when you realize that the Republican majority will do anything to demonize even the smallest subsection of immigrants. Whether that means sowing fear in communities by raiding homes in order to hunt people down, or denying access to care for legal immigrants who are entitled to care, no excuse is too ridiculous for Republicans to attack the immigrant community. And I'm not going to mince words here today. This bill is meant to do one thing. It's to deny care to people who look like me. The original sponsor of this bill even said that this legislation is designed to ensure, and I'm quoting, that no tax credits are given to undocumented individuals, and that he wouldn't vote for Trump care without this provision. Well, I hate to break it to everyone on the other side of the dais, but there are measures already in place to prevent advanced premium tax credits from going to ineligible people. There is a mechanism for Treasury to reconcile tax credits, and any undocumented individual found to have received a subsidy must repay it in full. That's right, there already exists a mechanism, and every single dollar must be paid back. I know that the other side will say that this measure will help fight fraud in the healthcare system. Well, again, I hate to break it to you with facts, but beneficiaries struggling to access care are not the perpetrators of fraud. These are good people who are trying to do right by their families and by their country. As the acting deputy commissioner mentioned in a hearing yesterday, the Social Security number was never intended, nor does it serve as a personal identification document. So the fact that we want to verify, use one of the methods to verify based on somebody's Social Security number, doesn't mean that you aren't going to harm people who are eligible for that tax credit, many of whom are children. Children who do not yet possess a Social Security number. So if you guys are fine by saying we're fighting crime and fraud by denying eligible children the financial help they need to get their health care needs met in this country, well then you can pat yourselves on the back and feel good about it all day long. I don't sleep at night thinking about things like that happening. So while it seems sensible and reasonable to you, put yourself in the shoes of somebody who doesn't have financial resources to waste or to wait on. I doubt there's a person here that if you were made to wait 2 months, it wouldn't make much of a difference. But for these people, it literally can mean the difference between life and death. Their health care and their lives are at risk, and yet a delayed procedure for you seems like a common sense solution. Well,
Would the gentlelady yield?
I will not yield. It's my time.
Oh, that's why I asked you to yield.
I will not yield, and please don't ask me to yield again. I feel very strongly about this bill because it's meant to target a specific group of people. And you can try to deny that all you want, but the fact of the matter is this bill is a solution in search of a problem. Because the Senate report was based on faulty reasoning, logic, and mathematics. And if you want to quote fake math all day long, you can do that, but it doesn't change the facts. And it also does not change the fact that there is currently a mechanism in place. So this bill is not needed unless it's some kind of political statement about how tough we can be on illegal immigrants who are fraudulently, trying to take something from the government. That is not the case here. This bill will not fix that because it is not a problem. Again, it is a bill with a solution in search of a problem. And with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Meehan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Meehan. And I guess, as my colleague just said about people who look like her, you're a person that looks like me. We both came from Ireland originally, at least our first folks came here. This has nothing to do with denying people anything. This has to do with enforcing the Affordable Care Act and verification. This is part of the Affordable Care Act. This is not something that I've dreamed of. This is not something that Mr. Barletta sat around saying, let's see what I can do to really make it hard on people. This is something that comes down to there's a verification process, and that's what's required. That's what's required. It has nothing to do with any of these other things. And if you just read the amendment it doesn't attack anybody. It doesn't go after any group specifically. It doesn't matter what part of the world you came from. All it says is verification is necessary before the credits or the subsidies are given. That's not a tough concept, and it has nothing to do with the color of your skin, the shape of your eye, the way you talk or don't talk. It just has to do with verification. It can't get any more simple and basic than that. And I think this is the situation that we get into. We're trying to make this into some type of a situation where we don't like these people so much that we're going to really make it tough on them. We're going to actually ask them to verify who they are in order to qualify for a subsidy that's funded by hardworking American taxpayers. And somehow, in my mind, I can't come to a point where that is anti-anybody. It just doesn't make sense. So I don't sit up all night sticking pins into a doll, thinking, how can I hurt these people? There's not one person here that wants to take anything away from anybody that they're entitled to. But by the same token, we are the stewards of every single penny, not dollar, but penny, that hardworking American taxpayers fund this whole machine with. And so when you ask somebody to actually follow the law, somehow that becomes you discriminate against people. You're asking people to do something they shouldn't be required to do. I wasn't here for the passage of the Affordable Care Act. But I know there's stipulations and there's requirements and there's verification that's specified under the Affordable Care Act. It just doesn't make sense to me that we're going to pick this to be an argument when at the end of the day, we're just trying to protect American citizens and American taxpayers. It is absolutely bizarre to me that this discussion would even get into something about we don't like people who were born and don't have a Social Security number. You don't just have to have a Social Security number, but it's just making sure that there's verification before we give subsidies out. That's not a hard concept. That's so fundamental. But as I said earlier, I've never seen any place that works less on economic fundamentals than the Congress. We just do things that are impossible to do in the private sector because we actually have to pay for them before we actually do them. So I'm just going to say, listen, Mr. Barletta, I thought had a really great idea to protect taxpayer money, to prevent fraud, and to make sure that the people who are deserving of these subsidies get them, and that people who aren't deserving of them don't, because every dollar that goes the wrong way is taken away from a dollar that could have gone the right way. But that's, again, that's basic to me. Maybe that's part of my Irish background. I don't know. And I've never thought of us as any different. By the way, I don't know where you all came from or who was there to begin with or who started you. But I do know this. We've been saddled with a heck of a responsibility, and it really is tremendous. It's a fiscal responsibility, and I'm never going to back away from that or try to defend, trying to prevent fraud and make sure that American taxpayer dollars are protected. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Mr. Amin controls the time.
No, I will not yield.
Ms. Chu, you're recognized to strike the last word.
I strongly oppose H.R. 2581. Lawfully present immigrants in the United States already face numerous health disparities and barriers to coverage, language and literacy barriers, fear of jeopardizing their legal status or the status of family members, or the difficulty of the application process itself, all result in an immigrant population that's significantly underinsured. H.R. 2581 would exacerbate these disparities by making it more difficult for immigrants who are here legally to obtain health insurance. Under current law, if a person is not verified in real time when applying for a premium tax credit, they're given a 95-day grace period in which to send in their documents proving their legal status, but in the meantime, they get their tax credits to obtain their health insurance. This bill would prevent these individuals from accessing tax credits while their citizenship or legal status is being verified. So let's say you have worked very hard to be a lawfully present immigrant. You would be forced to wait months for health care coverage, and these few months could be a matter of life and death. Now, actually, the same situation could occur for U.S. citizens. Let's say, for instance, a low-income U.S. citizen but who was born abroad or is in the process of becoming naturalized. Citizens are likely to have a difficult time producing needed documentation like a birth certificate or a record of a birth abroad, and many low-income U.S. citizens don't have passports. And then there are other citizens who may have changed their names, such as people who are newly married or people who have an error in their social security records. And then there are the unintended consequences of this bill that would fall on groups that can't wait for coverage, like newborns. Even if parents provide all the necessary documentation and apply at the hospital after giving birth, the delay for securing a birth certificate ranges between 1 and 6 weeks, depending on state processing times. Parents who did not apply for a Social Security number at the hospital, often because they haven't named the newborn, may experience even longer delays and must provide additional supporting documentation. And how about the survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, and their children, who could be prevented from receiving affordable care when they need it the most? These groups are likely to face delays because their immigration status information may not be stored electronically by DHS. The lags in entering data will cause many lawfully present immigrants, such as those granted status by court order or who were granted status recently. All these eligible immigrants could face significant delays in verifying their status. Now, we all know that under current law, undocumented immigrants are not eligible for subsidies, and asserting otherwise is simply and patently false. Instead, this bill would set up a system that could deny or delay individuals from receiving premium tax credits to help them afford health insurance. I strongly oppose H.R. 2581, and I encourage my colleagues to vote against it.
Mr. Doggett, you're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to first associate my words closely and completely with the gentleman from Ohio, my Republican colleague, who said that whether it's $750 million or $750 or $75 of fraud, we need to be out there trying to stop it. And I wish we could get the same level of commitment to stopping it that is being voiced regarding poor people, as was evidence yesterday when Dr. Clausen told us of $100 billion of tax dodging that was occurring, of profits earned here in America that were sheltered in some offshore tax haven. But there wasn't similar enthusiasm for that, or that we could get the same level of enthusiasm when pharmaceutical manufacturers defraud Medicaid, as happens one time after another, but we can't seem to get the same level of enthusiasm about that kind of fraud. That doesn't mean we shouldn't address it here, but it does mean that there's a great inconsistency. Now, as to Mr. Kelly, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, I know we got his Irish up, but you know, I don't think he's from a different galaxy. I see what the problem is because I looked at the document that he put in the record. And it's from Fox News, gentlemen. If you're listening and getting your information from Fox News, you do appear to be from another galaxy. So they put out a statement that illegal immigrants benefited from up to $750 million in Obamacare subsidies. But if you look at the original Government Accountability Office, I would tell the gentleman, they didn't find $750 million. They didn't find $750. They didn't find $75. They didn't find 1 red cent in their report. They discussed the amount of the subsidies that had not been eventually documented. They talked about the processes. They did not show that one immigrant took $1 improperly from this program. There may have been some, but none were documented by the Government Accountability Office. Now, my concern here is that the sponsor of this amendment made very clear when he introduced the bill that he was out and about to get at undocumented immigrants. In fact, he called them illegal immigrants. And he said that he wouldn't vote for Trump Care if this provision wasn't added to the bill. Now, while I want to prevent fraud, I also represent a number of families that have great difficulty, that have many barriers put in their way in getting access to health care. And many of these are children. That's why I asked Mr. Barthold the question about children. Many children that are out there, especially of working poor families, do not have a Social Security number. And I believe that Ms. Sanchez and Ms. Chu have both spoken passionately about the needs of those children. When they have a serious health care problem and they need access to a family physician, we ought not to be putting another barrier in their way. And that is just as important as protecting taxpayers, is protecting our neighbors, our disadvantaged neighbors. Many of our neighbors in hard-working families that are out there trying to make a go of it and comply with the law and to provide for their family. And why we would want to take steps to put more barriers in the way of children from those families, I just can't see it, except it growing out of the spirit of the author of this amendment, who says no Trump Care vote unless you're willing to do more about undocumented immigrants. We do need to do something about undocumented immigrants. We need to approve comprehensive immigration reform. But there's been an unwillingness to do what would be a major generator of economic growth and jobs, much more than some of these phony tax bills. There is a chance to do that ought to occur, but this particular bill ought to be rejected, especially for the reasons that my colleagues, Ms. Sanchez and Ms. Chu, have voiced, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. You recognize strike the last word.
I was going to speak to the merits, but Mr. Chairman, when you put together what was said by Ms. Sanchez, Ms. Chu, Mr. Kind, and Mr. Doggett, if you just listen to those 4 presentations, it indicates why we should not bring forth this bill. Just listen to what the 4 said. If you want to bring it up, go ahead and do it, but you're going to have a major battle on the floor because what the 4 of them have said and what we warned yesterday when this bill came up has turned out to be true. What Mr. Barletta said in his statements was without any factual foundation. There's no evidence of undocumented essentially applying for these benefits improperly or illegally. I yield back.
Thank you. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute?
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Sanchez, you're right. For what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for purposes of offering her amendment. Mr. Nunes? Point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentlelady to suspend while the clerk distributes. Gentleman withdraws his point of order. Gentlelady is recognized on her amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer an amendment that would also seek to verify first the status of advance premium tax credits for American citizens. Put simply, my amendment would protect American citizens from suffering a delay in the disbursement of their advance premium tax credits as a result of this bill, and I'm going to refer to them as APTCs. We already know that undocumented individuals do not receive APTCs, and this misguided bill is based on a faulty interpretation of a GAO report. We also know that there are many APTC-eligible American citizens who are more likely to suffer the unintended consequences of this bill. Low-income American citizens, particularly naturalized Americans from immigrant families, have a more difficult time producing the documentation needed to verify their citizenship. These Americans are also more likely to have errors in their records because of the spelling of their surnames or the number of people who share the same name that they do. Low-income Americans often cannot afford a passport and are financially locked out from this essential document. Given our broken immigration system, the process to verify one's immigration status can often take weeks or even months. A person should not have to wait months to enroll in affordable coverage and see a doctor simply because of our broken immigration system. Thus, my amendment seeks to verify the status of APTCs for all American citizens, not just those able to afford all of the documents. It works for all Americans by stopping the provisions of H.R. 2581 from taking effect if the Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services determines that more than 3% of American citizens eligible for APTCs see a delay. This common sense fix would ensure that those who need coverage the most, including newborn children, will not have to wait for our system to verify their status. I want to close by begging my Republican colleagues to prove to me that this bill isn't about shutting out immigrants from access to care. Prove to me that you care about the health and well-being of the eligible Latino, Black, Asian, and other individuals by voting for this amendment. I'm in agreement with you that ineligible individuals should not see a single penny of the APTCs provided by both the ACA and AHCA. Let's work together to make sure that other Americans are not caught up in the unintended consequences of this bill, and let's actually work on a better way. I thank the chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? Recognizing myself, I know the heart of this is to make sure there's not delays. Just so we understand, there is built-in processing time between sign-up and the beginning of coverage for those who enroll during the open enrollment. That's where most people seek that tax credit. So this will help ensure coverage occurs as seamlessly as possible while maintaining taxpayer protections. And to that degree, and I think it's sincere, delays for those who are eligible is not the goal. And so the American Health Care Act includes $1 billion to help accelerate these verification processes to address those very issues I think Representative Sanchez is correct in raising. The other thought, too, is that we know there's also special enrollment periods which are much shorter. And so Mr. Barletta's bills mimics the existing practice in those special enrollment periods to allow some enrollment flexibility to those who are subject to the verification delay. Final point. I think Ms. Sanchez's point that large number of delays aren't acceptable. I absolutely agree with that, which is why I think the goal shouldn't be to stop the verification process at that point, but to work to accelerate the verification process for those very folks. So for that reason, I oppose the amendment. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? The question is on agreeing the amendment offered by gentlelady from California. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no? No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
On that, I would ask for a recorded vote.
Sanchez asked for a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Okay, so when do I want to submit this now? I was going to submit
Mr. Johnson?
But this is on table.
Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, no. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, no. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, no. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, no. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, no. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, no. Mr. Marchant? Ms. Black? Mr. Reed?
No.
Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Renacci?
No.
Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan?
No.
Mr. Meehan, no. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, no. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, no. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, no.
You got me.
Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice?
Okay. All right.
Mr. Rice, no. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, no. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, no. Mr. Curbello? Mr. Curbello, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, aye. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, aye. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, aye. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, aye. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, aye. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, aye. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, aye. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, aye. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, aye. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Roscom? Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, no. Mr. Marchant? No. Mr. Marchant, no. Ms. Black? Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, no. Chairman Brady?
No.
Chairman Brady, no.
The clerk will report the vote.
16 yeas, 21 nays.
There being 60 ayes and 21 nays, the amendment is not agreed to. Are there additional amendments to the amendment of nature substitute? Before I recognize Mr. Doggett, I'd like to recognize Mr. Keller for unanimous consent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to enter into this a report from the Social Security Administration showing that 96% of newborns receive their Social Security number within 2 weeks on the average. And also, this is not fake news from Fox. This is a Senate report. It says, in March 2015, Chairman Johnson of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs initiated an inquiry into CMS's eligibility verification process and into the process used to recoup improper payments. The inquiry found that CMS had awarded ACA tax credits on behalf of more than 500,000 individuals who CMS later determined to be ineligible for coverage and tax credits. The inquiry also found that CMS and IRS lack an effective plan to recoup credits that CMS awarded to ineligible individuals. The majority staff estimates that CMS distributed approximately $750 million in taxpayer funds in the form of tax credits and anticipates that the IRS is unable to fully recoup the funds. This pay and chase model has potentially cost taxpayers approximately $750 million, and I'd like to submit this into the record.
So without objection, both documents be submitted. Mr. Doggett, for what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, a verify First Amendment.
Gentleman from Texas recognized for purpose of offering his amendment. Mr. Nunez. Point of order has been reserved. Clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentleman to suspend while the clerk distributes.
What's the, I think I just need you to mark the key point I'm going to read, so I don't have to read the whole article, but just where the, just circle, she said don't sign it, and the Ethics Committee said, the Office of Government Ethics said sign it. Yeah. And that's this year's return, right? Or is it last year? I just have to get the facts right. Thank you.
Gentleman from Texas recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a genuine Verify First Amendment. I believe that before we pass a dime of further tax breaks or riddle the tax code with other fine print that enriches some, we need to verify first how much President Trump and his family will be enriched. The many corporate entities over which he exercises control would be enriched, and to know whether this is about personal enrichment or is it about the enrichment of our economy. We should also take this opportunity to verify that there's no other conflict of interest and to verify first that there is no Russian collusion. Since we considered this matter previously, and I offer this amendment for myself and Mr. Pascrell has raised it on a number of occasions concerning the history of Internal Revenue Code Section 6103 and the responsibility of this committee to utilize appropriately that section of the Internal Revenue Code. Since we discussed this last with the last amendment I offered, of course, in the most disrespectful and unpresidential way, the FBI director has been fired. Just prior to his firing, he was asked about the tax returns and the role that they play, and he said, this is former FBI Director Comey, quote, they show motive, income, and can show criminal activity. Seeking and using tax returns in an investigation is not uncommon, and especially in complex financial cases, it's a relatively common tool. Well, it is a tool that this committee ought to be fully utilizing to verify first what is the effect relative to the president. Mr. Chairman, since we visited before, we do have other evidence that some people have reviewed the president's tax return. In fact, the president produced a letter from a law firm that is located across Pennsylvania Avenue, just down the way toward the White House, across the street from the Trump International Hotel. And they maintain that they reviewed his tax returns for 10 years, including any tax documents from the more than 500 separate entities of which he has a working interest, and they gave him a clean bill of health as having no Russian involvement. It is noteworthy that the same law firm that did this has a press release up on their website, or at least they did, that they were honored as the Russia Law Firm of the Year. And so we got clearance and review, but only by the Russia Law Firm of the Year. And since that time, we have learned that that same law firm advised President Trump not to personally sign his financial disclosure for last year, but fortunately, they were overruled by the Office of Government Ethics. Mr. Chairman and members, there is a serious issue here concerning conflict of interest, concerning the impact on what we are doing on taxes. We know also that if we review the information just from the 1 year on which we have 4 pages of tax returns in 2005, that if Mr. Trump's tax proposal were adopted and the minimum tax was totally eliminated, he would have paid a mere 3.48% in taxes that year, saving him over $30 million. There are serious tax issues involved here, and I just don't see, after all that has happened with the jeopardizing of our national security, the unceremonious firing of the FBI director, and the information we know that we need to review and have it reviewed by someone other than the Russia Law Firm of the Year, that this committee can continue to shirk its responsibility to utilize Section 6103, and I would yield to my colleague, Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Yin of University of Virginia, who has written many articles concerning checks and balances, has written many articles on the question of taxes and when taxes should be summoned. I want to refresh everyone's mind here that through the 20th century, there are many examples given that the only way you really check out conflicts of interest is to have persons' tax returns and schedules and addendums put together. In 1924, the only entity that was able to summons a tax return from anybody was the President of the United States. That's what the law read then. But in the question...
The gentleman's time has expired.
Okay.
Mr. Nunes, you recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order on the amendment because it is not germane to the amendment in nature of a substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because it addresses a subject completely outside the scope and subject matter of the bill.
Does the gentleman offering the amendment wish to speak on the point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman, and would yield to Mr. Pascrell to add words in my behalf.
Yes, sir.
In the subject of whether an entity, one entity or the other, and, you know, where was the Congress in all of this? Why couldn't the Congress ask? Well, we asked the President of the United States at that time, was Calvin Coolidge. He was reluctant to give anybody any information about any financial endeavors that was going on during his administration. And so what he really precipitated was the action by the Congress of the United States of America. That Congress stood up. That Congress was able to change the code, which permitted 3 different committees to request someone's taxes. So they kind of went over Coolidge's head, and then Coolidge became cool and decided that he would allow the Congress to do its thing. He backed off. And from that day on, the Congress of the United States and the 3 entities which we know about, this being one of them, the Ways and Means, the Joint Committee on Taxation, and the Senate Finance Committee, any one of those committees can summons anybody in the executive branch of government. So I'm not only talking about the President of the United States, we're talking about the Secretary of the Interior, the Secretary of the Treasury. Because if you remember in the Teapot Dome scandal, the Secretary of the Interior was found guilty after all the attempt to hide all the information. But he never got to jail because he got sick. And I said it once before, there was a murder involved in that situation too, which I will not go into now, but it's very interesting if you want to read it about it. So, the equal branches of government was at the heart of all of those debates. And that's how the information was garnered from Mr. Coolidge and from Secretary of the Interior Fall. They didn't want to give us the information. They didn't want to give the government the information, but they had to. That's when 1924, the Code 6103 was changed. 6103F, paragraph 1. It was very clear that we have the responsibility and we have the ability under the law is on our side, if we want to find out about what's going on. And the deeper we get into the travails of this president, we have a right to know. We have a right to know what are those potential conflicts so that he rids himself of any potential conflict, so that he won't have to worry about, they won't have this cloud hanging over his head any longer. And the cloud is getting bigger, and it's getting darker, and it looks like we're going to have a lot of rain. So we could prepare ourselves for it. Now, the Washington Times has a great article today, Mr. Chairman, a great article. It says that the president is getting ready to sell public lands to private entities like oil companies. Deja vu. Here we go again. But this time, the law is on our side. The last time, Secretary Fall thought he could get away with murder and stealing. And there were Democrats as well as Republicans involved in this scam. Oh no, this wasn't, neither party is ever privy to virtue, Mr. Chairman. And that is why I asked to do it in a bipartisan way, but you chose to go the path of loneliness. Mr. Chairman, this is serious, serious, serious business. So, we come to an interesting part into the history of mankind about these tax returns and what we're going to do about these tax returns. And in this latest article that appeared 2 weeks ago...
The gentleman's time has expired.
Can I finish my sentence?
I am within briefly.
Sure. I recommend you read the article, Mr. Chairman. I recommend it because there are 7 specific reasons why we should do what is being requested tonight. So it'll make us all look good, and it strengthens the vitality of our legislative branch of government, our branch.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your
Pesco.
time.
I am prepared to rule the amendment is not germane to the amendment of the nature substitute as it violates House Rule 16, Clause 7 by introducing the subject completely outside the narrow subject matter of this bill. The point of order is sustained.
Mr. Chairman.
Amendment is not in order. Mr. Doggett appeals ruling the chair. Mr. Nunes moves table the appeal. Questions on the motion table the appeal of the chair's ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion
Record
table
vote.
is agreed to. A roll call is requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Nunes? Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding?
Aye.
Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Carbello? Mr. Carbello, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Johnson? Ms. Black? Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, yes. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson, no. Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
Clerk will report the vote.
22 yeas, 16 nays.
There being 22 ayes and 16 noes, the motion to table is agreed to. Are there additional amendments to the amendment? The nature of substitute. If there are no further amendments, questions on the adoption. Amendment, the nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment, the nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Nunes for the purpose of offering the motion.
Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 2581 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. H.R. 2581 is amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 2581 is amended. Is ordered favorably reported to the House. A roll call vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Nunes? Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Aye. Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Carbello? Mr. Carbello, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Mr. Delbene? Or Ms. Delbene? Oh, Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, no. Ms. Chu?
If the members will suspend while the clerk continues the roll call vote, we'll finish quickly.
Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Johnson? Ms. Black? Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, yes. Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
22 yeas, 16 nays.
On this vote, the ayes are 22 and the noes are 16. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 2581 is amended as ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives without objection. I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.